There is a reason hell trembles when a believer opens their mouth and speaks words their mind did not create. There is a reason unseen forces recoil, retreat, and lose their grip when heaven's language is released through human lips. It is not because of human strength, education, or eloquence. It is because something eternal is being activated, something older than darkness itself. When you speak in tongues, you are not speaking from earth toward heaven, you are speaking from heaven into the earth, and the spirit realm recognizes the source immediately. Too many have been taught to treat this gift lightly, as optional, emotional, or unnecessary. But darkness has never treated it that way. Demons do not debate the reality of tongues. They do not question its power. They respond to it with panic, because it disrupts their order, exposes their hiding places, and burns against their resistance. What you may hear as syllables they recognize as authority. What you may feel as faith rising, they experience as pressure increasing. The moment tongues are released, the believer steps out of the natural and into direct cooperation with the Spirit of God. Speaking in tongues is often misunderstood because it does not appeal to human logic or emotional display in the way people expect spiritual power to manifest. Many assume that if something does not sound intelligent, structured, or impressive to the natural ear, it must be insignificant. But the spiritual realm does not operate on human standards. The greatest works of God have never depended on human brilliance, volume, or performance. They depend on obedience and alignment. Speaking in tongues is not emotional noise produced by excitement or suggestion. It is a divine spiritual weapon released when the human spirit yields to the Spirit of God. The power is not in how it sounds, but in where it comes from. When a believer speaks in tongues, they are not inventing language or expressing feelings. They are allowing the Spirit to speak through them beyond the limitations of the mind. The natural mind always wants to understand before it acts, but faith operates in reverse. Faith acts because it trusts the source. Tongues are the ultimate act of trust because the speaker surrenders control of words, structure, and meaning. This surrender is what makes it powerful. Darkness cannot dominate a believer who has yielded control to God, because control is the very thing the enemy seeks to steal. When the believer willingly yields to the Spirit, the enemy loses leverage immediately. Emotional expression rises and falls with circumstances. A person can feel bold one moment and fearful the next. Emotional prayer depends on mood, energy, and environment. But tongues are not fueled by emotion, they are fueled by divine supply. Even when the believer feels weak, tired, confused, or under pressure, the Spirit remains strong and precise. Tongues allow prayer to continue effectively even when emotions fail. This is why they are a weapon, and not merely a spiritual experience. Weapons are designed to function under pressure, not comfort. Demons are not disturbed by emotional enthusiasm. They have witnessed human passion for centuries, and are not impressed by volume or excitement. What unsettles them is authority. Authority is recognized instantly in the spirit realm, and tongues carry authority because they originate from the Spirit of God Himself. When tongues are spoken, the believer is no longer praying from their own understanding. They are praying from God's understanding. That shift is devastating to darkness because it removes the possibility of manipulation, distraction, or deception. Another reason tongues are a weapon is because they bypass the enemy's ability to interfere. When a believer prays in their natural language, the enemy can anticipate patterns, exploit fear, and inject doubt. But when the Spirit prays through the believer, the enemy cannot interpret, predict, or counter the prayer. Tongues are encrypted communication between the Spirit of God and the will of God. Nothing is wasted, nothing is misdirected, nothing is delayed. Every utterance accomplishes exactly what heaven intends. Many believers underestimate tongues because they evaluate spiritual power by visible results. They want immediate external change to validate internal obedience. But tongues often work beneath the surface first. They weaken strongholds before they collapse. They loosen chains before they fall. They shift atmospheres before circumstances move. The enemy understands this process and reacts early because he recognizes what is being activated. What looks quiet in the natural is loud in the spirit. What feels simple to the believer feels violent to darkness. Speaking in tongues also strengthens the believer internally, which is why it terrifies the enemy. A strengthened believer is harder to intimidate, deceive, or exhaust. Tongues build spiritual endurance. They sharpen discernment. They stabilize faith. The more a believer operates in tongues, the less reactive they become to fear and pressure. The enemy loses his ability to provoke emotional responses because the believer is no longer operating from emotional energy, but from spiritual supply. This is why tongues are not optional for spiritual warfare. They are not an accessory or a secondary gift. They are a primary means by which the believer maintains spiritual dominance. When believers neglect this gift, darkness gains space to operate. When believers activate it consistently, darkness is pushed back without confrontation, argument, or struggle. The believer does not fight for victory, they enforce it through alignment with the Spirit. The enemy's greatest advantage has always been human ignorance. Tongues destroy that advantage because they connect the believer directly to divine wisdom. Even when the believer does not understand what is being said, the Spirit is addressing matters beyond human awareness. Hidden attacks are exposed, future traps are dismantled, spiritual pressure is relieved before it manifests in the natural. This is why tongues feel mysterious to the mind but powerful to the spirit. Speaking in tongues is heaven's language released through a surrendered vessel, a spiritual fire that does not rely on emotion, understanding, or circumstance, but operates purely on divine authority and intent. The unseen realm is not distant, symbolic, or inactive. It is operating constantly alongside the natural world, responding to authority, alignment, and spiritual sound. What most people perceive as silence is often filled with movement, reaction, and resistance in places the natural senses cannot detect. When a believer speaks in tongues, something immediate occurs beyond human awareness. The atmosphere shifts, authority is asserted. Lines are crossed between heaven and earth. The unseen realm reacts not because it is curious, but because it is being confronted by a force it cannot ignore or withstand. Spiritual sound carries origin, and origin determines impact. Words born from human reasoning remain limited to human influence, but words birthed by the Spirit carry divine weight. When tongues are spoken, the sound does not originate in the intellect or emotion. It originates in the Spirit of God and is released through human cooperation. The unseen realm recognizes this instantly. Angels respond with alignment. Darkness responds with disruption. Nothing remains neutral. Every utterance produces movement because spiritual sound cannot exist without consequence. Demons do not react to tongues out of superstition or fear of the unknown. They react because tongues disrupt their structure. Darkness operates on order, hierarchy, and deception. It depends on predictable patterns of human behavior, emotional cycles, and mental reasoning. Tongues introduce a language that cannot be tracked, analyzed, or anticipated. The moment tongues are released, the enemy loses situational awareness. He cannot discern strategy. He cannot measure progress. He cannot determine timing. This loss of control creates immediate instability in the unseen realm. The unseen realm is governed by authority, not explanation. Demons do not require understanding to obey. They require authority to submit. Tongues carry authority because they bypass the human will and operate under divine direction. When a believer speaks in tongues, they are no longer acting independently. They are functioning as a vessel through which heaven speaks. This is why reactions occur even when the believer feels nothing. Feelings are irrelevant. Authority is active regardless of emotional confirmation. There are battles occurring around believers that they are not consciously aware of. Strategies forming, attacks positioning, pressures building. Tongues intervene in these moments before the conflict reaches visibility. The unseen realm reacts violently because its plans are being interrupted without warning. What was forming is dismantled. What was advancing is stalled. What was hidden is exposed. This reaction is not dramatic in the natural, but it is decisive in the spirit. Darkness thrives in secrecy. It gains strength through unseen access and delayed detection. Tongues strip that advantage away. They bring divine illumination into places the believer does not yet see. The unseen realm reacts because light has entered areas that were previously uncontested. When tongues are spoken, they do not address symptoms, they confront root causes. They do not negotiate with surface issues. They penetrate layers of resistance. This depth of operation is what triggers panic in darkness. The unseen realm also responds because tongues activate angelic cooperation. Angels are ministering spirits assigned to assist in alignment with God's will. When tongues are released, divine instructions are being issued beyond human language. Angels respond to those instructions. Movements are coordinated. Assignments are executed. Protection is reinforced. The enemy reacts not only to the sound of tongues, but to the mobilization that follows. Darkness recognizes when it has been outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Another reason the unseen realm reacts is because tongues establish dominion. Dominion is not asserted through struggle but through alignment. When a believer speaks in tongues, They are stepping into their rightful spiritual position. They are no longer reacting to pressure. They are ruling over it. The unseen realm responds because authority has been restored to its proper place. Where dominion is present, darkness cannot remain comfortably. It must either submit or withdraw. The unseen realm is highly sensitive to spiritual authenticity. Empty words produce no reaction. Repetition without alignment carries no force. But tongues spoken from a surrendered heart carry unmistakable authenticity. They are recognized as legitimate spiritual action. This legitimacy is what provokes response. Darkness knows when a believer is cooperating with heaven, rather than striving in their own strength. That cooperation is intolerable to opposing forces. Even silence after tongues is charged. Residual authority lingers. Atmospheres remain altered. The unseen realm does not reset instantly. What has been shifted requires time to reorganize, and that reorganization weakens the enemy's position. Tongues do not merely cause a momentary reaction. They create lasting spiritual displacement. What once had access finds resistance. What once flowed freely encounters obstruction. This is why consistent use of tongues creates long-term spiritual stability. The unseen realm becomes accustomed to resistance. Attacks lose momentum, pressure decreases, confusion dissipates. The believer may not perceive the scale of what is happening, but the unseen realm does, and it responds accordingly. Speaking in tongues is not passive. It is active engagement with a realm that is constantly watching, reacting, and adjusting to the authority being released. Demonic power does not primarily operate through strength but through ignorance, misdirection, and distorted perception. Darkness advances most effectively when people do not know what is happening, why it is happening, or what authority they possess to confront it. The enemy rarely announces his presence openly. Instead, he works subtly, shaping thoughts, emotions, and decisions in ways that feel natural and unchallenged. Ignorance is the environment in which his influence thrives, because what is not recognized cannot be resisted. The moment revelation enters, the balance of power begins to shift. Revelation is not the accumulation of information but the unveiling of truth. A person can possess knowledge about God and still remain vulnerable if that knowledge has not become revelation. Demons are not threatened by religious familiarity, memorized phrases, or routine belief systems. They are threatened by awareness that produces alignment with truth. When a believer begins to see reality as it truly is rather than as it feels or appears, deception loses its footing. Revelation exposes lies not by argument but by replacement. Because truth does not debate darkness, it displaces it. Ignorance allows oppression to masquerade as normal life. Fear is mistaken for personality. Anxiety is accepted as responsibility. Exhaustion is justified as productivity. Spiritual pressure is redefined as circumstance. In this state, the enemy operates freely because the believer does not recognize the source of what they are experiencing. Revelation interrupts this pattern. When truth is revealed, the believer realizes that what felt inevitable was never authorized. This realization alone weakens the enemy's hold, because his power depends on remaining unnamed and unchallenged. Demons lose ground when they are exposed because exposure removes their strategic advantage. Darkness depends on hidden access points and thought patterns, beliefs, and emotional responses. Revelation shines light into those areas, making continued operation difficult. Once a believer recognizes how the enemy works, the tactics lose effectiveness. Fear no longer produces paralysis. Temptation no longer feels irresistible. Confusion no longer feels permanent. The enemy's voice becomes recognizable, and recognition leads to resistance. Revelation also restores authority. Many believers live beneath their spiritual position because they do not realize what has already been granted to them. Ignorance causes them to ask for what they already possess, plead for what has already been authorized, and tolerate what has already been defeated. Demons exploit this gap between provision and awareness. Revelation closes that gap. When a believer understands their authority, their posture changes. They no longer negotiate with darkness, they command it. That shift is catastrophic to the enemy's influence. This is why demonic resistance intensifies when revelation begins to emerge. The enemy attempts to distract, discourage, or overwhelm because he recognizes that once truth is fully grasped, his ability to operate diminishes rapidly. Revelation does not need to be complete to be effective. Even partial awareness begins to destabilize deception. Each insight removes another layer of darkness, another excuse for bondage, another justification for fear. Speaking in tongues accelerates revelation because it aligns the believer with divine perspective rather than human interpretation. While the mind may remain unaware, The spirit is being instructed. Hidden things are being addressed. Confusion is being clarified at a level beyond conscious thought. This is why clarity often follows seasons of praying in tongues without explanation. Revelation rises quietly, often recognized only in hindsight when patterns break and peace replaces pressure. Ignorance also keeps believers reactive. They respond emotionally to situations rather than spiritually to sources. Revelation shifts responses from reaction to authority. Instead of being driven by circumstances, the believer begins to govern them. This governing posture is intolerable to darkness, because it removes the enemy's ability to set the agenda. Once the believer understands what is happening beneath the surface, manipulation becomes ineffective. Another reason revelation collapses demonic power is because it produces confidence, not arrogance, but settled assurance. Fear thrives in uncertainty. Doubt flourishes where understanding is absent. Revelation brings certainty, and certainty stabilizes faith. A confident believer is not easily intimidated. The enemy relies on intimidation to maintain control, but intimidation loses force when the believer knows who they are and what they carry. Revelation also restores responsibility. Ignorance allows passivity. Believers assume that change will happen without participation. Revelation reveals that authority must be exercised, not admired. This realization moves the believer from waiting to acting, from hoping to enforcing. Demons lose ground rapidly when believers stop waiting for deliverance and begin applying authority with understanding. The collapse of demonic power is not dramatic because of confrontation, but inevitable because of exposure. Darkness cannot coexist with revealed truth. It has no defense against light. The moment a believer begins to see clearly, the structures that once supported oppression begin to fail, because the enemy's greatest weapon has always been the absence of revelation. The natural mind is designed to reason, analyze, and seek control through understanding. It is valuable for navigating the physical world, but it is limited when dealing with spiritual realities. The mind requires information, sequence, and explanation, while the spirit responds to authority, alignment, and truth. This difference is critical to understand, because many spiritual struggles persist not due to lack of faith, but due to over-reliance on the natural mind. When the mind insists on understanding before yielding, it inadvertently restricts what the spirit is able to accomplish through the believer. Speaking in tongues disengages the dominance of the natural mind and places the believer in direct cooperation with the Spirit of God. This is not a loss of control, but a transfer of control from human limitation to divine precision. The mind is accustomed to leading, questioning, and interpreting, but tongues require submission rather than comprehension. In that submission, the believer steps into a realm where effectiveness is no longer dependent on mental clarity or emotional confidence. The Spirit operates independently of human awareness, addressing matters beyond the believer's perception. The natural mind is vulnerable to fear because it relies on visible evidence and logical outcomes. When circumstances contradict expectation, the mind struggles to maintain peace. This vulnerability is often exploited by darkness through worry, doubt, and mental exhaustion. Tongues bypass this vulnerability by operating outside the mind's framework. The believer may feel uncertain, but the Spirit is not uncertain. The believer may lack direction, but the Spirit possesses perfect clarity. When tongues are spoken, prayer continues unhindered by confusion or anxiety, allowing divine intent to proceed without interference. Another limitation of the natural mind is its tendency to focus on symptoms rather than sources. The mind reacts to what is felt and seen, while the Spirit addresses what is hidden and forming. Tongues allow the Spirit to pray directly into root causes that the believer does not yet recognize. This direct engagement is why results often appear disproportionate to the simplicity of the act. Situations resolve without explanation. Pressure lifts without confrontation. Clarity emerges without analysis. The Spirit has been working beyond the believer's awareness, adjusting circumstances at a level the mind could not access. Darkness understands the power of mental control, which is why so much opposition targets thought patterns, assumptions, and internal dialogue. When the enemy controls the narrative in the mind, he influences decisions, reactions, and endurance. Tongues disrupt this control by silencing the mind's dominance and allowing the Spirit to lead. The enemy loses influence because his primary access point is bypassed. He can no longer inject fear or distortion into a process he cannot enter. The mind also tends to personalize spiritual conflict, interpreting resistance as failure or inadequacy. This creates discouragement and fatigue. Tongues remove the personal burden from the equation. The believer is no longer striving to perform or impress. They are simply yielding. This yield is powerful because it removes pressure and restores flow. The Spirit does not struggle to accomplish His will. He executes it. When the believer yields through tongues, that execution proceeds without obstruction. Praying in tongues also protects the believer from praying inaccurately. The natural mind often prays based on incomplete information, emotional urgency, or limited perspective. Tongues ensure that prayer aligns perfectly with God's will. There is no wasted effort, no misdirected request, no contradiction. Every utterance is precise. This precision is threatening to darkness because it eliminates inefficiency. The enemy thrives when prayers are unfocused or rooted in fear. Tongues produce focused, authoritative spiritual action. The direct operation of the Spirit also strengthens the believer's inner alignment. Over time, consistent use of tongues retrains the believer to trust spiritual leading over mental reasoning. Sensitivity to divine prompting increases. Discernment sharpens. Decisions become less reactive and more intentional. This internal recalibration weakens the enemy's ability to manipulate responses through emotional pressure or mental fatigue. Another critical aspect is that tongues operate continuously, even when the believer is unaware of immediate outcomes. The Spirit does not pause for explanation. He continues working, interceding, correcting, and reinforcing alignment. This uninterrupted operation creates momentum in the unseen realm. While the mind may feel stagnant, the Spirit is advancing. Darkness reacts because it perceives movement even when the believer does not. Bypassing the natural mind does not diminish intelligence or wisdom. It places them in proper order. The mind becomes a servant rather than a master. When the Spirit leads and the mind follows, spiritual authority flows without resistance. Tongues establish this order consistently, reinforcing the believer's connection to divine power rather than human limitation. This is why tongues feel uncomfortable to the natural mind. Discomfort signals loss of control. But that loss is precisely what enables divine operation. When the believer allows the Spirit to operate directly, without filtering through analysis or emotion, authority is released in its purest form, and darkness is confronted by a power it cannot reason with, resist, or override. Many people assume that power in the spiritual realm is demonstrated through volume, intensity, or dramatic display. They believe that the louder the prayer, the stronger the authority, and the more forceful the emotion, the greater the impact. But the unseen realm does not respond to noise, it responds to order. It does not react to passion, it reacts to alignment. Demons are not impressed by shouting, repetition, or emotional strain, because they have witnessed human emotion for generations. What unsettles them is not how loudly a believer speaks, but how accurately that believer is aligned with divine authority. Alignment means agreement with God's position, not effort to persuade Him. When a believer is aligned, they are not trying to generate power. They are allowing power to flow through an established channel. This distinction is critical. Begging implies distance. Striving implies uncertainty. Alignment implies authority already granted and now exercised. Demons recognize this immediately. They know the difference between a believer trying to reach God and a believer standing with God. The former produces noise. The latter produces command. The enemy thrives when believers believe they must fight for victory rather than enforce it. When believers assume that authority must be earned through intensity, they exhaust themselves and remain vulnerable. Alignment removes exhaustion because it removes striving. The believer is no longer pushing against resistance. They are standing in position. Demons do not fear human effort because effort can be interrupted, distracted, or depleted. They fear alignment because it is sustained by divine order rather than human energy. True alignment is quiet but weighty. It does not need to announce itself. When a believer is aligned with God's Spirit, their words carry legitimacy. Legitimacy is what the unseen realm responds to. Demons are legalists by nature. They operate through unauthorized access and exploit perceived permission. Alignment revokes that permission. It establishes jurisdiction. Once jurisdiction is established, resistance becomes illegal. This is why demons retreat not because of argument, but because of authority asserted through alignment. Another reason alignment terrifies darkness is because it removes negotiation. Emotional prayer often negotiates, pleads, or explains. Alignment does none of these. It simply declares reality as heaven defines it. Demons cannot negotiate with reality. They can only attempt to distort perception. When alignment is present, distortion fails. The believer is no longer asking whether something is God's will. They are operating within it. This certainty destabilizes the enemy's strategy. Because uncertainty is one of his primary tools, alignment also produces consistency. Emotional intensity fluctuates, but alignment remains stable. Demons learn patterns quickly. They recognize when a believer operates only when motivated and withdraws when tired or discouraged. Alignment eliminates this predictability. Even when the believer feels weak, alignment remains intact. Authority continues to flow. Darkness cannot wait for a better moment, because there is no lapse in position. This constancy is deeply threatening to an enemy that relies on timing and fatigue. When a believer speaks in tongues from alignment, they are not attempting to force change. They are releasing what is already established in the spirit. This release feels effortless because it is not generated, it is transmitted. Demons fear this transmission because it carries unaltered authority. There is no emotional distortion, no mental interference, no personal agenda. The spirit communicates exactly what is necessary, and the unseen realm responds accordingly. Alignment also clarifies identity. A believer who is aligned knows who they are and who they are not. They do not confuse humility with weakness or submission with passivity. They understand that submission to God results in authority over darkness. Demons lose leverage when identity is settled, because insecurity is one of their most effective entry points. Alignment closes that door permanently. Another aspect that terrifies demons is that alignment multiplies impact beyond awareness. The believer may feel calm, even ordinary, while the unseen realm experiences disruption. Emotional display often seeks feedback, but alignment does not require confirmation. It trusts divine order. This lack of dependence on visible response makes alignment unstoppable. Darkness cannot manipulate reaction or discourage continuation, because the believer is not dependent on sensation. Alignment also invites cooperation from heaven. Angels respond to order, not chaos. When a believer is aligned, cooperation increases. Movements are coordinated. Resistance is met with reinforcement. Demons recognize when a believer is supported rather than isolated. This recognition accelerates retreat, because opposition becomes costly and unsustainable. What demons fear most is not noise that fades, but alignment that remains. Noise can be ignored. Emotion can be waited out. Alignment cannot be undone without confronting divine authority itself. When a believer speaks from alignment, they are not representing themselves. They are representing heaven's position in that moment. Darkness does not panic because of sound, but because of standing, because alignment removes every advantage, exposes every trespass, and enforces authority that does not need to shout to be obeyed.